In this episode, we speak to Kelly, who was the former head of the RCMP's Diamond Programme. In this episode, we explore the roles of diamonds, precious gems, and metals in financial crime, and we see how these three items can be exploited by organised crime and by money launderers. We'll hear from Kelly about some of the uses that organised criminals use diamonds for, use precious metals for, and how they can be mitigated by the industry. We'll also hear some of his anecdotes from his career in the RCMP. We'll also hear how Kelly transitioned out of the RCMP into the private sector and began a career working in a financial institution.
Thanks for joining me this morning to talk about diamonds, gemstones, precious metals, and their role in financial crime. I think this is a really exciting area, and I'm sure all my students watching will find that as well. I'm really interested to know about your background with the RCMP. So during your career, you were the Diamond Program Coordinator for the RCMP, responsible for investigating, dealing with crimes related to the criminal use of diamonds, gemstones, and precious metals. I'm wondering, could you give a flavor of what this role entailed?
Right. Yeah. So it's one of those things that evolved over time, Ian. And so I've always had a passion for diamonds and jewelry. Matter of fact, ever since I was a kid. And so when I went through university, actually as a geologist or taking geology, that was my passion. But in leaving university, there really wasn't any jobs in geology at the time. The metals were in the toilet, and both my dad and my brother were in the RCMP, and really espoused that career path as something that I might enjoy. I always had the thought that if I go that route, I can always go back to geology at some time. And so I did. I went into the RCMP, but there was really no opportunity to use my knowledge at that time. Somebody might throw a rock through a window, and I could tell them that's a piece of andesite or something like that. But there's really no use for geology at that time. But in the late 90s, 1998 in particular, Canada became one of the world's largest diamond producers, opening up the Caddy mine in Northwest Territories, and since that time, several other mines as well. So at that time, they were starting to look in the RCMP for people that might have some sort of knowledge that could be applied to understanding what that might mean in a criminal sense, the RCMP. I had, just again out of interest, I had already taken several courses on my own in gemology through the Canadian Institute of Gemology and other places. And so between my university training and some diplomas, I was well suited to be able to provide that sort of guidance to the RCMP. And sort of fell into a role as the Diamond Program Coordinator, where I was coordinating information on more at the rough diamond level, the diamond mine production level, as related to criminal activity that might be surrounding that. But what we quickly learned was that diamonds, gemstones, and precious metals were really more apt to be used by your street-level criminals, on your drug traffickers, and be inserted into all kinds of criminal organizations as a method of storing wealth and as an alternate currency. And so the original program was to look at intelligence and potentially investigations around the rough diamond sector, but it quickly evolved to something much bigger than that, and more than just Northwest Territories, became kind of wide.
Wow, it's really interesting. You mentioned who were the likely users of diamonds, gemstones, and precious metals being the lower level criminals. I think that's something that really surprised me when I looked into that. In addition to your day-to-day role in the RCMP, you were a member of the delegation to FATF for the money laundering topology review on the use of diamonds in money laundering. So building on your experience in the RCMP, can you describe how diamonds and other precious gems could be used in criminal activity and in money laundering?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, it's really subject to somebody's imagination, but the acronym I like to use is one called SWOP. It stands for status, wealth, alternate currency, and profit. And ultimately, the fundamental reason that criminals going to incorporate these products, diamonds, gemstones, precious metals, into their criminal activities or organization is a function of profit. But if you look at the utilization side of it, it depends where you are on the criminal hierarchy. The lower level criminals will use it as a currency. They'll trade it for drugs. It's very common for these things to be stolen, and then from residential break and enter, from a theft or robbery, and traded for drugs the same day. Some tremendous statistics out of that from some studies done out of Britain and Australia about the propensity to trade stolen property for drugs, and finding that in these studies they were, and some of them were replicated too, that about a third of the participants only traded for drugs. So they would steal products out of a residence, and they would take those products to a drug dealer and trade straight across for drugs. And of course, other ways to get rid of them are through jewelry stores or fences or pawn shops, that kind of thing. And yeah, so it really depended where a person is on the criminal hierarchy. The more higher placed criminals, call them mid-level, they might use them for not only a alternate currency and use them in the same manner where they're trading up for drugs for more drugs, or they might sell them for cash for their day-to-day expenses. But they might start to store these things for wealth as well, put them away or have them on hand. They don't necessarily need to sell them on a day-to-day basis. And in many investigations that I had, you'd find large collections of jewelry, sometimes between $500,000 and $1 million worth of product that would have been stored away. And then if you go to the most highest placed criminals, organized criminals that are into various types of criminal activity. But if we want to stick along the themes of drug production, drug distribution, then you're really starting to look at using these things as a storage of wealth. And there's also an alternate side to it as well, and that is as a function of a status symbol. And so you start seeing these criminals that will adorn themselves in very high-end pieces of jewelry and collect high-end pieces of jewelry. Also use them as a way of rewarding people within their circles, as that sort of thing. And so as a function of either of acquiring them, they're using proceeds of crime, or they're laundering monies that they've made through their organization for products.
Wow. So multi-use, really. In terms of how prevalent is the use of diamonds and precious gems in the money laundering process?
Yeah, so really, it depends on the type of criminality involved, and and then within that type of criminality, the where they are, like as I was just talking about, where they're placed. So if they're a low-level criminal or a high-level criminal, how they're going to use it, how much they're going to use. But if we want to, the one thing that touches us all in every corner of the Canadian judiciary is drug trafficking and drug related crimes. So if we stay in that theme, it's very prevalent. And one thing I always advocate to law enforcement officers is that in any drug-related case, I would say look for the jewelry, because it's either, if you're a street-level criminal, then they're usually acquiring it through some sort of low-level criminal activity, like a break-in or a theft. If they're mid-level, then they're trading for it. If they're high-end, then they're acquiring it for money or for wealth accumulation, that kind of thing. So in any way, shape, or form, if you're dealing with some sort of narcotics-related criminal activity, I'm always saying you got to be on the lookout for it as relation to crime.
Absolutely. And you mentioned earlier a study from the UK, my home country. I'm very curious how, if you have any insight into how the utilization of diamonds and precious gems vary between different jurisdictions. Are there any hotspot countries or any jurisdictions where it is more or less prevalent?
Yeah, fantastic question, Ian. One of the best places in the world for criminals to use diamonds, gemstones, and precious metals is actually North America. So both Canada and the United States, and it's really a function of the availability. There's a study done by a fellow by the name of Clark years back. I don't know if you're familiar with that one, where he looked at studied a number of criminals and why they would steal some products from houses and that kind of thing. And he came up with an acronym, and it was called CRAVED, and it stands that CRAVED is a concealable, removable, available, valuable, enjoyable, and disposable was the key elements to that research. But availability ends up being one of the key parts. But the most important was the most important aspect was disposability at the far end of the CRAVED, the B part. And so, if you look at the North American market, to your question, where is a great place in the world to use it? Well, sure, the developed countries around the world, but North American market, if you think about availability, well, the United States, with approximately 5% of the global population, consumes about half of the diamond jewelry in the world. So there's an amazing amount of jewelry that's just out there. People's homes, they buy it for special occasions, anniversaries, gifts. It's a wedding gift. It is part of the engagement process, and there's tons of it out there. But as we know, the jewelry doesn't go stale, doesn't evaporate over time. We don't throw it out like food in our fridge. It stays, people pass on, or they pass the jewelry on, and it recycles around. And so there's so much jewelry in North America that moves in and out of the legitimate jewelry market. And so just as there's that many more places that sell and offer jewelry and diamonds, gemstones, and precious metals, those kind of things, in North America, there's that many more places that will buy it off the street or buy it to bring it back into the legitimate market as well. So North America would be, like, in my opinion, a hotbed of places to buy and sell. But notwithstanding that, most places in most developed countries would be places to either buy or sell. It's really easy for criminals then to incorporate into their criminal enterprise.
And that poses a real challenge. I think it's sort of a double-edged sword, because we have so much existence of these items, and there are many legitimate, obviously, reasons for trading in these items. One of the challenges, I'm thinking of the audience of this video, we might have students who are moving into compliance roles with financial institutions, and they're maybe seeing some transactional activity involving the sale or the conversion of diamonds and gemstones, precious metals. Are there any indicators which might help those compliance officers identify potential suspicious transactions?
Yeah, so you know what, that's always where the rubber meets the road on these things, right? And it's really about the unusual activities, and hence why we call it unusual activity or suspicious transaction report. So things like a small shop that would be dealing with way more gold than they would typically sell. So they're bringing in way more gold that is already smelted, or it's brand new, or it's high carat gold. That can be really, when we're talking about high carat gold, 22, 24 carat gold, we're really talking about money. We're not, as a piece of wealth, we're not really using that so much as a piece of jewelry for ornament. It really just stores the wealth. Start having high carat gold. Or a jewelry store that might normally sell maybe 1 carat diamonds in a year, and they're moving 60 through there, and they're of a particular quality as well that are different. So when you're looking at from a compliance standpoint, you don't really get a chance to look at the invoices, do you? Those don't come across your desk as a compliance person. But what you can see is the sales receipts as it relates to what's moving through the bank account. So how much transactions are, and where are those things coming from? Are transactions coming from overseas and so on and so forth? Is that consistent with what you could expect for a small shop? Or is that more consistent with something you see with a very large shop? So one of the things that becomes most important, it doesn't matter if it's, you know, if you're looking at casinos or you're looking at jewelry stores or notary publics, whatever the case may be as a reporting entity, or any business or corner of the market, or any economic sector. It's really about understanding what is the norms within that sector, and then spotting things that are inconsistent with the norm.
I think in respect to diamonds and precious gems, as you alluded to, it's a very technical area. You mentioned quality, carats. You know, it's a very technical subject. If someone wanted to learn more about diamonds, precious gems, precious metals, and how they could potentially be used to launder funds, or how they could better upskill their knowledge about, as you say, what would be a substantial amount of stones versus a very maybe cheaper option that might be more in line with a smaller retailer. What kind of resources exist, or are there any training courses or certifications which could be explored?
So there's a gap because there's really not anything out there that provides you with that information aside from actually working in the market, you know, and then knowing what is legitimate and what's not. Notwithstanding that, as a function of my work that I did with the RCMP, I created several training courses when I was there. And I've since leaving, I offer those up to law enforcement specific training that I offer up through a organization called Jewelers Vigilance Canada, and that gives them an opportunity to see exactly what we're talking about from not necessarily firsthand, but for me to provide that information to them as to what would be perhaps normal, or what would be usual, what would be unusual. You know, specific details about the market that average person wouldn't get unless you're actually in the market themselves.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of the market, I'd like to turn the conversation a little bit closer to home and talk about your career, because, you know, having a look at your resume and your experience, it's very varied, and I think it covers a lot of the professions and the niche sectors where the students of this course may be interested in. When we talk about your role with diamonds, precious gems, and metals, it's a very specific career path, and I noticed that you spent over 10 years in this particular role. So that role must have had some appeal, and I think you did touch upon it earlier because of your university training and your interest. But was there one thing that really appealed to that career path for you?
Yeah, so I had, when I worked with the RCMP doing this job, I have to say I probably had the best job in the RCMP, because I absolutely really enjoyed what I did. And unlike a lot of, aside from general duty policing, where you sample a whole lot of different things as a function of day-to-day work, when you start to specialize, you actually get, siloed into very specific investigations. As a function of my role, I actually got to plug into all kinds of different things. I got to plug into drug investigations, crime, smuggling, even human trafficking. It was a very, what's the other ones, intellectual property. Because jewelry can be used in all these different ways, you know, from the fraud end of the spectrum to being stolen as a function of robbery, or you know, being used in any one of these things as a function of a laundering scheme as it relates to firearm criminals. So I really got to see a spectrum of criminal activity and be participating in a spectrum of criminal activity. So, yeah, quite a unique place to be. But at the same time, if it wasn't for the fact that there's being so widespread, I don't know if it was just in one small area and being used in one small area, I don't know if there would have been perhaps the need to focus as much as I did on that, rather than be a little bit more generalist in one of those other fields.
And after leaving the RCMP, you changed career path, much like many of us leaving law enforcement, and moved into the financial institution sector, working compliance, fraud investigations. You moved into a role working fraud special investigations for a relatively large financial institution. What differences did you first observe when you made that transition, or were there any things which stayed the same?
Yeah, so the two, well, so I've done two roles with the financial institution. I was in risk management. That's when I first left policing and went into risk management, and basically transferred roles about threat assessments and risk assessments over to the enterprise risk management side of the house at a bank. And then from there moved on to the fraud and special investigations side of the house. So the two things that I have to say is, first of all, even working in with economic crime or proceeds of crime and doing so many bank warrants, that kind of thing, if a person thinks in the policing side that they've got a decent handle on what happens in a bank, it's not even close at all. Not until you get into that seat and you work at it for maybe a year do you start to really get a handle on how banks operate. They're very complex and very sophisticated organizations. It takes a bit of hand-holding, a little bit of time before you really understand how they operate and the intricacies and connections between them as well. And the second thing is really about accountability. In the you work in police offices and tremendous accountability in those places, but I hazard to say that the accountability in the private sector, in particular as it relates to financial institutions, may even be higher than I found in and that is that was a bit of an eye-opener.
Really, it's a very different culture working in the private sector than in public sector, and that's certainly a personal observation I made. I'm curious, with your 10 years working with diamonds, gems, and precious metals, moving into the fraud and special investigation side of things, did you ever have a chance to leverage those skills and that knowledge in your private sector role?
So the occasional time with banking, it would come up, but quite frankly, in what I did use it a lot, but it was more to maintain contacts. I had a lot of law enforcement jurisdictions from across Canada that would continue to call me to provide assistance as they related to investigations they had with, diamonds, gems, and precious metals, and that those contacts, it was great to maintain, using that to maintain those contacts as again related to what I was doing with frauds and financial services.
In terms of your career, obviously, it sounds as if you've had many roles which you've really enjoyed, and that's very hard to find sometimes, to find a job that you enjoy. If someone was thinking of following in your footsteps, they've heard your experiences, they'd like to follow that career path, what advice would you give to them?
Oh, that's easy. So find first of all what you love, what you absolutely love and like doing, really, really love and are passionate about, regardless of how much money you think you're going to make on it. You got to get up out of bed for, or specialize in this and get up out of bed for 25 years, 30 years of your life. This is going to be a career, no matter what institution you work for. And you should really be very passionate about it. So it carries with you your whole life. And you're not just in it for the money. And even if it, roles might come up where you might have the opportunity then to move to a higher place role from perhaps more money that takes you out of what you really love, you really have to think about whether it's worth that to do it or not. And if it's really about enjoyment of what you're doing and being passionate about it, then make sure that you follow a career path that takes you down that path, and don't be too enticed to leave it for more money in a different position that takes you out of it.
And to flip that question around, obviously having progressed through a number of roles, I'm always keen to hear personal reflection about a career path. Upon reflection, is there anything which you would have done differently in your career?
No, I so far I've had tremendous success with what I think I've been doing, but it's really I didn't really graduate through the corporate ladder, so to speak, in both positions. I've in both careers I've had in the RCMP or financial sector. It really was about enjoying the position I was in, really relishing the enjoyment, and that's been the reward. And so when I look back on that, if I would change and do something different, I don't think so. I've had some very fortunate experiences, and I wouldn't trade those.
That's very it's a very envious position to have, I must admit. Speaking of the current situation, it would be remiss if we didn't ask about the COVID-19. Obviously, we're living in we're living through a global pandemic, and we've obviously made a lot of changes. Obviously, we're speaking via Zoom. How do you anticipate COVID-19 impacting the criminal use of diamonds, gemstones?
Love that. So let's just look at the shutdown with COVID-19, right? So we have a couple of things. Two sides to this, and I don't want to forget the other side when I talk about the first thing. So the first thing is what happens when you have all these jewelry stores that shut down. Everything went into mothball in late March through April, May, and things started reopening. Criminal use of diamonds is a function of one of the things is for the theft, the robberies, and all that other stuff that goes on with it. Those were eliminated, pretty much wiped off the map for 3 months. And so if you actually graph it out, you'd see that we had, average thefts and robberies in January and February, and then the graph just dips down. And you start to see in late June and early July, you start to see the thefts and robberies start to come back up again. Now, what's really interesting about that is those typical things that have been stolen for people who live hand to mouth, the street urchin, the low-level criminal, drug abuser. What was happening then for them? How were they meeting their needs? Those opportunities were gone. First of all, the second component is the thing that wasn't eliminated by COVID, and that was the cyber threat that comes with online sales. As we know, that has increased tremendously over this period, and a lot of jewelry companies putting up the hurry up offense to all of a sudden get their store into online sales so they can maintain sales, and then the pitfalls that come with that, and the potential losses that would happen with that as well. So we have that side of the coin. First of all, the dynamics of the thefts that didn't happen and the losses that didn't happen, and then the different types of losses that could happen as a function of the increasing in cyber. That's one side. Actually, maybe that's two. But then there's the other thing that happens too, because not only did jewelry stores close down, everybody shut down the last of the world. And so you look at the traditional avenues that criminals would be using to launder crime. And so we'll talk about restaurants, casinos, these kind of things. What are they doing with all their cash then in the meantime? Are they filing? And then when things start to reopen, where is that money going to? So, and as things gradually reopen, where is that money going to, and what avenues would that money be going into? If online sales exist and could continue to exist for that might be an avenue that could have expanded during COVID. And depending on what jurisdiction a person was in, or the type of criminal activity that an organization is into, they might have shifted some of the laundering from one modality to another, and that might have included more laundering moving towards the jewelry sector than some of the other sectors, or vice versa, depending on things being closed down. And an examination of that will need to be done, but you can expect that to be some shift, one way or the other.
And I suppose, obviously, speaking about COVID-19, where we are now, when we eventually, hopefully, emerge into the new normal, you mentioned when COVID first hit, there was a massive drop-off in terms of activity. When we start to reopen, would you expect an immediate return to previous activity, or would there be something else?
So you know what, I liaise with jewelry loss prevention people across North America on this, and in May, the expectation was as things start to open at the end of June and July that we'd see a flood. Floodgates are open, and it's no holds barred, and we see lots of activity. That really hasn't been the case in Canada. The U.S. has a different dynamic going on there. They had in June like riots and stuff like that that resulted in looting and things like that as relates to the jewelry sector. But that's different. That's an anomaly relative to what we're talking about as being normal. But in Canada, we haven't seen that return to the levels that we had in, let's say, January. And we really won't know until maybe things start to return a little bit more to normal, if that's actually the case. But what's really interesting about this, Ian, is that the ability for somebody to steal now and not get caught is almost easier in that it's really convenient for somebody to wear a mask. And so that when they do a grab and run, or they do a reach over the shelf and steal through the open and stealing some jewelry out of the case, or even a robbery, the fact that they're wearing masks right at the start, and that's the moment, makes it easy for them to get away. And you would think that from a criminal mind standpoint that you would see more of these, but that's not the case. The levels that we're seeing now are, I would suggest, are a little bit lower than what we would have expected.
I must admit, I came into this conversation thinking that diamonds, gemstones were a very niche market in terms of financial crime, in terms of money laundering and wider criminality. I've certainly learned a lot myself about how multi-purpose or multi-use these items are, and also who utilizes them as well, and how they're utilized. It's really opened my eyes. So thank you for that, Kelly. In terms of our conversation today, if you had to give one parting comment to financial crime professionals watching this, what words would you have for them?
So what I would say, and this even takes me back to the policing side of the house, when I was a police officer and specializing if you're trying to determine criminal activity around a particular sector of business, you really have to immerse yourself within that. You have to understand that business as if you were in it. And if you can get, in a parallel universe, people want to become police officers and they go do ride-alongs with police in order to understand how it works and the dynamics of it, and the culture and that kind of stuff. If you're interested in understanding how things can happen within casinos, the time there, go understand them. If it's jewelry, then understand that, or any business that you might want to develop a niche in. Auto theft, garages, that kind of thing. You really have to understand it from the business side of it, then in order then to understand where the gaps are, not only in business gaps, but also the legislative gap. And then those are very much exploitable by criminals. Police looking over your shoulder because there's a legislative gap that exists in or something. So really get your nose into the business or into that particular niche from that business standpoint that you were actually doing yourself, and that will prove unbelievably valuable to you in the end.
That's a lot of really great advice. I go back to the earlier question we spoke about when you spent 10 years in that particular role, and you mentioned it's because you were doing something you love, and I think that's a perfect way to end our discussion today. Kelly, thank you so much for your time, and I do hope you'll come back in the fall and speak to my class for a little bit longer.
Oh, I'm more than happy to. Thanks for the invitation, Ian.